Welcome back, everybody. We are in week 11 of our text study of Luke's first chapter. Did you ever imagine that you could study a single chapter in Luke's gospel for 11 weeks and you're still here? So thank you for that. We'll have a discussion here at St. Mark on Wednesday morning at 9:30. You're welcome. You know the routine by now. And these are our themes in the month of November. And today we're going to look at the birth of John the Baptizer. So, given that that's our theme, here's the thing I want you to think about with regard to that birth. And that is, we're going to hold questions about the power of community and tradition. So, when I read through the text just now, I want you to listen for signals, moments, references to both community, various types of community, and tradition. And then we'll try to point that out a little bit more as we walk through the text verse by verse. We're going to spend some time talking about this on Wednesday, in addition to a couple of other things. So let's read the text. We're going to read verses 57 through 66. And you recall that we just had Mary visiting Elizabeth. Their exchanged Elizabeth's words and then Mary's Magnificat. And now we got the rest of the story after Mary had stayed with her for 3 months. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown his great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. On the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him Zechariah after his father. But his mother said, "No, he is to be called John." And they said to her, "None of your relatives has this name." Then they began motioning to his father to find out what name he wanted to give him. He asked for a writing tablet and wrote, "His name is John." All of them were amazed. Immediately, Zechariah's mouth was opened, and his tongue freed, and he began to speak, praising God. Fear came over all of their neighbors, and all these things were talked about throughout the entire hill country of Judea. All who heard them pondered them and said, "What then will this child become? For indeed the hand of the Lord was with him." All right. So we've got some interesting things to look at here. Let's just break this down verse by verse, starting with verse 57. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. We know that Luke had been marking time over and over with respect to when someone conceived, when they're in their 5th month, when they're in their 6th month, and now time to deliver. So the cycle of pregnancy and birth has been part of Luke's way of structuring this story. And what's interesting in this verse to me is that there are 2 different words here that could be translated to bear or to give birth. And the first one comes initially, which is tikto. And we've seen that throughout this chapter. We saw it in verse 31. We're going to see it in chapter 2, verse 6, part of our Christmas story, where Mary gives birth to a child and they named him Jesus. We're going to see it in the very next verse in chapter 2, and then later in chapter 2. So it's a very common word throughout Luke's story, but it's not the only one. So when it says in this verse, time came for Elizabeth to give birth, that's tikto. And then when it says she bore a son, that's this next word, genao. I'm never quite sure whether that gamma, that's the first Greek letter there, is like a G. And I can't tell whether it should be a hard G or a soft J. So don't take my word for it. I'm just doing the best I can here. But I do want you to notice this term. I'm gonna point out a couple of Greek terms today, and I'm not doing that just to kind of be Mr. Smart Guy. I think it's very interesting because you're familiar with this term genao, at least the first 3 letters. So you've got a gamma, which is like a G, an epsilon, which is like an E, and then a nu, which is like an N. All right? G-E-N. That transliterates into English into words like gene, or genetic, or generate, or generations, right? So all of those words we have in our vocabulary, they really go back to this Greek root of this word, which means to bear, to bring forth, to give birth. And they talk about our connection in terms of birth. So just remember when you see this word genao, or when I point it out, just think about the word gene, or genesis, or genetic, generations. Words like that, you can probably come up with a lot more on your own, because we've adapted this into our language. And this is actually the word that's used in John's Gospel about being born again. So it's taken on some kind of non-physical, more spiritual connotations as well. Remember all those genealogies? Same three letters start that word. Jehoshaphat begat Nehemiah, Nehemiah begat Alphatiah. You know, all those crazy names that we can hardly pronounce. And it's begat. That's this word. Genao, your begat word. And it makes up the genealogy. So that's a familiar word to you, whether you knew it or not. How cool is that? Okay, so Elizabeth has borne a son. So typically in this age, you have, at this moment, the gender reveal party. Elizabeth has known for some time that she would have a son. Verse 58, her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown his great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. So this phrase, shown great mercy, this is the language of the Magnificat, right? The word shown great is this same word magnified, that the Latin term Magnificat, the same Greek word used at the beginning of Mary's saying that we studied last week. And remember, Mary talks about mercy, God showing great mercy, God remembering God's promises. So what's happening here is that we're picking up on the language of the Magnificat in terms of John the Baptizer. So it's another moment where Luke is making a deliberate parallel between one birth and the other. And then this is really fascinating to me, is that Luke mentions two different groups, neighbors and relatives. Neighbors and relatives. And I'm giving you the Greek term here, again, just because I think it's very, very interesting how these words are constructed. And we're going to see some relationship between these words and other words. So the word translated neighbors is periokoi. Periokoi. Now you're familiar with that, with both halves of that word. The prefix is peri, which means around. So think of our word perimeter, right? That's the meter around, the measure around. So perimeter, we already know the prefix peri means around. And the word oikoi, that's plural for oikos, which means house or home. And you know that word too, because one of our most familiar words in our language is made up of that word and the word for law, which is nomos. And that word is oikos nomos, which we pronounce economy. So like if you ever took home economics in high school, that's actually a redundant phrase. Economics means the law of the home. Oikos and nomos means law. So here you have perioikos, those housed around, living around. And for us, a simpler term for that is neighbors. And then you have relatives. And here, in this word relative, you also have a prefix and a stem, and you know the stem, which is genes, G-E-N, right? We've got that word for giving birth, for generations, for genealogy, for genetics, right? And sug, the first three letters, S-U-G, That's a form of the word sun or sin for together. Together. When you stick that prefix onto a word that starts with a G, you make it S-U-G. Su, genes, genes, together. I think the most literal translation of that word might be gene pool, right? When you pool your resources together, this is the gene pool. And it's translated relatives, right? People who once swam in the same gene pool with Zechariah and Elizabeth, people who share their genetic connection, people who are part of their generation. So that's an interesting term, and it kind of keeps that language of the genealogy going here, which makes sense. Luke is telling genealogical stories here, stories of birth, stories of origin, stories of genetic connection. I think it's kind of fascinating. So we've got these two groups here, neighbors and relatives. So I think we can ask some questions now. What are the roles of neighbors and relatives when it comes to traditioning? Okay, I'll make a little more sense of that verb, traditioning. I verbed the noun as we go along, but what are the roles of relatives and neighbors? And then, what kind of monoculture is presumed in this story? And what I mean by that is when we read in the New Testament the story here taking place in Judea, right, we just take for granted that these neighbors and relatives are all Jews, right? So they share a certain history, they share a lot of tradition, they share sources of authority, they share expectations, they share a lot more than they don't share, right? And typically you're identified by whose child you are and whose child that was. So this is your identity. It's not so much your personal identity, like we have in our kind of individualistic approach to identity, but it's a communal identity. And in some respects, this is a monoculture, and by that I mean it's very different from what we're going to see in the book of Acts, when suddenly you've got a Jew like Paul going to a city in what is now Turkey called Ephesus, or going to Rome, for crying out loud. And now you've got a church in Ephesus, and a church in Rome, and a church in Iconium, church in Philippi, made up of people who are not monocultural. You've got Gentiles and Jews. And among them, there are some differences. I want to argue there are some pretty strong differences between Galilean Jews and Judean Jews that you can see in some of the Gospels. But in particular, when you get to the book of Acts, the monocultural assumption in this story is really broken apart. And it's the cause of many controversies, as well as the opportunity for many great innovation in the church. So, as we read this story, just think about what kind of monoculture is presumed in this story. And that raises the question of, if we're going to have traditions that are meaningful, living traditions, as opposed to, some kind of burdensome tradition, does that assume that we have to have a monocultural context for that to work well? Or can that work in a multicultural context? I think that's an ongoing question for the church. It has been from the beginning, continues to be now. So that's one of the kinds of questions we're going to address together on Wednesday after learning from this story. Verse 59, on the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child. And they were going to name him Zechariah after his father. All right, so some really interesting things happening in this verse. First of all, on the 8th day, that was a command from the book of Leviticus, chapter 12, verse 3. On the 8th day, you bring that child to be circumcised if it's a male. There are a lot of on the 8th day presentations of sacrifices and so forth. Why the 8th day? There could be any number of practical reasons. We might be talking about an era, at least back when Leviticus was being written, and maybe in the 1st century as well, when infant mortality rates were pretty high. And perhaps the thought was that the child makes it past that first week into the 8th day, the chances of them being viable are greater, because that's when they name the child, according to the way we can see the custom here. It might be that the mother has needed a week, either for something like ritual purification, since there's so much blood loss and so forth that happens during a birth, or maybe simply to get our health and strength back. I don't know quite how things happened in the red tent and all of the aftermath of things like that, but for any number of practical reasons, it could be the fact that they waited till the 8th day to name a child, and to circumcise a male child, which officially identifies that child as a Hebrew. So this raises a lot of questions, none of which we can answer, but all of which we can wonder. The word circumcise, just for your information, has a prefix, peri, like perimeter, like peri, oikos, neighbors. Peri is to cut around. Peri, temno, is to cut around. That's the word for circumcise. And that's almost literally what circumcise means as well. Circum is a Latin term for around, and size means to cut. But just notice the casualness with which Luke says, and they were going to name him Zechariah. They. What's the antecedent for the pronoun, the plural pronoun they? It's not Zechariah and Elizabeth. It's neighbors and relatives. So this is part of the tradition. The tradition is, and it's a religious tradition here in some ways, that on the 8th day, you bring the child, for whatever reason, on the 8th day, right there, you circumcise the males, you name the child, and they, the group enabling this tradition, were going to name him Zechariah, after his father. It's interesting that it's the community that's going to name the child and not the parents. And we'll get back to why they were going to name him Zechariah. But it raises a couple other questions. What is the power of a biblically commanded tradition? Not just a tradition like this is how we do things around here, but a tradition where you can say Leviticus chapter 12 verse 3 says on the 8th day you got to bring this boy to be circumcised. What's the power of a biblically commanded tradition? And related to that, and this is an important question, how did that tradition get to the point of being biblically commanded in the first place? Now, this may sound like I'm going off the rails a little bit. Just because it's written in the scriptures, and you can point to chapter and verse and say it's commanded, that's one thing. But then you can ask the question, how did that happen? Remember, Jesus, when he was told that Moses had commanded, Moses, it doesn't say God, Moses had commanded certain things about divorce. Jesus says, Moses commanded this. Moses made this command because of the hardness of your heart. But here's what God really wants. So Jesus is willing to say, look, just because God said it, that settles it for me. That's not the way I interpret Scripture. Sometimes the Scriptures say something that were needed for the moment because of human frailty, but are not the unchangeable Word of God. That's kind of interesting. Same thing with the Sabbath, right? You've got this command for the Sabbath, but Jesus says, where did that command come from? What's the origin? What's the purpose of it? And then says, the Sabbath was made for the good of humans, not humans for the Sabbath. So, when you've got a biblically commanded tradition, how did it become biblically commanded in the first place? And what kind of continuing weight is it supposed to have for us? Those are real questions, and Jesus asked them. Verse 60, so they said they wanted to name him Zechariah, but his mother said, no, he is to be called John. Now, I have no idea why Elizabeth is insistent on the name John. If you go back to where Gabriel visited Zechariah, I don't remember him saying, and you shall call him John. I don't know where the name John comes from. We can speculate that a little bit on Wednesday, but I'm going to be running out of time if I do it now. But notice this, that Elizabeth is following tradition, right? They're bringing John for circumcision on the 8th day, and they're naming this child there on the 8th day with the relatives and the neighbors, but she's also breaking the tradition. No, she says, not John, not Zechariah, but John. So, can there be a tradition of breaking tradition? We better hope so, especially if you're Christian. When Jesus would say something like, you have heard it was said, but I say to you. Well, that first reference, you have heard it was said, is a tradition written in the scriptures. But I say to you, is changing that tradition. And if you follow the path of Jesus, you're part of a tradition that breaks with tradition. And if you're Presbyterian, that's important too. We can talk about that on Wednesday. But it does raise a question. How do traditions change over time? Ought traditions to change over time? Now, listen to what the relatives and neighbors say to Elizabeth when she says his name should be John. They say to her, none of your relatives has that name. That should be familiar to you. You probably have heard it many times in a church. We've never done it that way before. We've always done it this way. So this is, but understand the role this plays. This is pushback. The neighbors and relatives are pushing back against Elizabeth about what her child's name should be because it's breaking with tradition. What I don't know, in addition to not knowing why the name John seems to be of such importance, is why anyone would insist that children had to be named after relatives. I don't know of that tradition necessarily being a tradition in the scriptures. I can't think of examples in the Old Testament where that happens. I think Cain had a son named Tubal-Cain, something like that, but it wasn't his name. It wasn't just Cain. We do have two examples in the scriptures. There's Bartimaeus, whose name literally means son of Timaeus. And then Mark, knowing that his readers may not know that, calls him Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, which literally is son of Timaeus, son of Timaeus. There's also the figure Barabbas when you get to the cross, Barabbas. Some people feel like his actual name was Jesus, and Pilate is offering a choice between Jesus of Nazareth and this other Jesus, and so they call him Jesus Barabbas. The word Barabbas means son of a father. That could be anybody's last name, right? It doesn't seem to really be a proper name per se, but maybe an identifier to distinguish two people whose names may well both be Jesus, a fairly common name in the first century in Palestine. We know the practice of relative names being passed down to children. My name, you know me by Mark, but my first name is Donald, and that was my maternal grandfather's name. My older brother's first name is Robert. That was my dad's name. My younger brother's first name is Perry. We call him Perry, but his middle name is French, which was my paternal grandfather's middle name. And then, of course, Chris and I have 4 children. Our oldest son is Robert, named after my dad. His middle name is Michael. We call him Mickey. in honor of my uncle who was killed in Vietnam. Our second son, Luke. Luke is an original family name, but his middle name is Alphonse, which is my father-in-law's middle name. He was Leo Alphonse. And then Nicholas, his middle name is Mark. And then Abigail, her middle name is Rose, after my mother-in-law, Rosemary. So each of our kids has a family name. So this seems to be a relatively common thing in some cultures, but I don't know that it's necessarily common in biblical culture. So that says an interesting thing about traditions, right? What's the power of a tradition if it's not strictly a biblical or a commanded tradition? Sometimes those traditions tend to take on even more power than the biblical tradition. I'm going to keep moving here because I've still got a long way to go. Then they began motioning to his father, Zechariah, to find out what name he wanted to give him. This word motioning, not so much like a recognized sign language, it was more gestured, waved. It means to beckon somebody. It could be this, it could be that. So it's a very crude form of sign language before it gets standardized and becomes more elaborate. So they asked him. So Zechariah asked for a writing tablet and wrote, "His name is John." And all of them were amazed. So watch this very carefully. I want you to tell me the difference between "his name is John" or "John is his name." And I didn't mean to add a period to the second one. That's not meant to be the difference here. But look at those two statements. His name is John. John is his name. On Wednesday, after the initial question of, do you have any questions about the video or the text? My question to you is going to be, what do you think is the difference between these two sentences? And do you see a difference? That's all I'll say about it for now. And then you have this phrase, and all of them were amazed. That word amazed, we saw it already. When Zechariah was in the temple for so long, everybody was amazed at his delay. We're going to see it in the second chapter during the birth narrative. The shepherds come and tell everybody about the angel visitation that they had, and all who heard it were amazed. We're going to see it later in the second chapter when Mary and Joseph take Jesus to the temple, and a man named Simeon there is going to say some marvelous things about Jesus, and Mary and Joseph are amazed. So being amazed is kind of a biblical prescription for how to respond to what God is up to. In verse 64, immediately Zechariah's mouth was open and his tongue freed, and he began to speak, praising God. All right, so now we're starting to see the physicality of Zechariah's muteness. It wasn't just that, he tried to talk and nothing came out, but his mouth seemed to be locked in some way. This is hard to imagine how he survived 9 months if his mouth actually couldn't open. And his tongue freed. The word freed or loosed there, as the King James Bible puts it, there's not really a verb there, but a tongue doesn't open, so we supply a verb to say that now the muteness is gone and the physical constraints are gone, and Zechariah begins praising God. This is that word eulogeo, eulogy. We saw that before. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. That's that word. We're going to see it again when Simeon receives Jesus, when he comes for circumcision, and they name him, there. Simeon is going to use this language. All right, and then verse 65, fear came over all their neighbors, and all these things were talked about throughout the entire hill country of Judea. So we get hill country again, right? And now it's the entire hill country. Somebody's been, go tell it on the mountains. One hill country people to another one everywhere, right? So now all of them are talking about it and talking about all these things. Remember a couple weeks ago where we saw the word things and the literal translation is words? I think on Wednesday it would be good for us to discuss the connection between words and things and why this term rhema can be interchangeably interpreted either as word or thing in stories like this. But notice that fear came on all the neighbors. So now this is the Magnificat being acted out because Mary talked about those who fear God. And remember, we said that could be revere. It doesn't mean they have to be scared to look at God or think about God. And in this moment, it doesn't mean people necessarily are scared, but they're moved by this. This is something powerful happening right here among us. If that doesn't move you in your core, then you are not paying attention. And then verse 66. All who heard them, these things, these words, pondered them and said, what then will this child become? For indeed the hand of the Lord was with him. Okay, a couple of things here. The word pondered, we've seen that before, but we've seen it in the English translation. This is a different word. I don't think if a Bible translated that first word pondered, they should translate this word pondered because it's actually a different term and kind of means discussed more than pondered. And you know what I don't understand, it takes a judgment to decide where the quote ends. The people could have said to one another, what then will this child become? For indeed the hand of the Lord was with him. Or they could have just said, what then will this child become? And then you have a narrator inserting a commentary, for indeed the hand of the Lord was with him, to explain why there's fear and why they're wondering what this child will be. It's hard to see exactly what the naming or the misnaming of Zechariah Jr. as John means to cause and instill fear. But when you see Zechariah suddenly loosened, his tongue loosened, his mouth open, him praising God, now something about this birth becomes really important. Next week, we'll see what Zechariah said, and I got to tell you, he goes on and on a bit. You might find yourself wishing his tongue would not so loose. And I wonder whether where exactly this question, what then will this child become, where that comes from. Is it a response to Zechariah's experience? Is it a response to the naming? It's kind of hard to say. At any rate, what we have here is the birth of John the Baptizer, and what I want to explore with you on Wednesday is the power of community and tradition. There can be a negative side, there can be a positive side. We'll explore both then. See you then. Thanks. Bye.